Hey guys, today we're going to be learning about how to properly clean your soldering iron and just general good soldering iron cleaning practices. So the first thing you're going to need is something to clean your soldering iron with. So I use this little thing I got at Home Depot. You can find it in the plumbing aisle. It's essentially a bunch of little metal wires inside that are good for cleaning the soldering iron. You just stick the iron in and it cleans it really well. This is my favorite thing to use. A lot of people don't even know that it exists, but it's by far my favorite little tool. You can also use a sponge, which works okay, but not as well as some of the other things, as well as brass wool works pretty well. Just make sure you have something underneath the brass wool, because I've used it before and gone right through it and then melted what was underneath it, so just be wary of that. The other thing you're obviously going to need is some solder. I'm using some lead-free solder right now, but leaded I always recommend, so use that whenever possible. And of course your soldering iron. So you can see mine is pretty black, it's pretty dirty, even though I rubbed it in here a bit. I can only do this so much, it's only going to work so well and get so much of it off. So what I'm going to show you is something called tinning. So tinning is essentially when you take a little bit of your solder and you put it onto your soldering iron. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to try and get some on there. See, it's so black I can't even do it properly. Let's see if I can get a little bit on the other side. Man, this is pretty bad. Can't even get it. There we go. So I got a little bit on there. And I'm going to take whatever I'm using to clean it and just clean that on off. Now, as you can see, I've got this little bit of silver showing. So that is really good. We want that all over our soldering tip in an ideal scenario, because that is what's going to provide good conduction between what you're soldering on and the piece you're soldering on. So I'm just going to continue this. I'm going to add a little bit more solder to this and quickly clean that off. Make sure you have a fan going whenever you are soldering. Obviously I can't have it on right now because I'm talking as I'm doing this, but I'm not breathing in. Let's say that. I'm not breathing in while I'm working on it. So now I've cleaned that off, and now it's even more silver than before. I'm still not quite happy with it. I want to get a little bit on the other side here. And now it's looking a little better. Now this is good enough for me. Like, it's probably not going to get much better than this, knowing this soldering iron. It's not like the most amazing soldering iron in the world, but this is good enough for me, so I'm happy with it. So that was tinning. So again, tinning is like putting a little bit of solder on your soldering iron, and then cleaning it off really quickly. And then just a good cleaning practice is every couple solders. I do it about every 5 solders if I'm going quickly. If I'm going really slowly or I'm doing quite large solders like wire to wire and whatnot, then I usually just clean it every time, because my iron is not very good and the tip is not very good. So I just clean it every time, and then I don't have to tin all the time. I'm not standing there waiting for it to conduct properly. I'm ready to go always. So just, good practice, clean the tip of your soldering iron on a regular. Hey guys, it's Morgan. Today we're going to be going over how to set up a soldering station at home. A lot of us are home right now, so it'll be a really useful thing to be able to solder outside of the workplace. So the first thing that you're going to need is some kind of mat. I'm just using this old self-healing mat because I don't care if little bits of solder get on it, but make sure you have something that won't instantly melt. This melts a little bit when the iron is on top of it, but that's okay because it's an old mat. Make sure it's nothing flammable. Ideally you want a proper soldering mat, or a piece of metal is okay as long as you have something underneath it like wood to kind of act as a heat shield there. Just make sure that your area is clear. Like, I don't have any scraps around here. There's nothing flammable. There's nothing that can get wrecked, because sometimes when you're soldering, little bits of solder, which is what these little metal discs are here, can kind of get everywhere if you're not being careful with it. So just make sure you have a clear area and some kind of mat underneath. The next thing that you are going to need is proper safety equipment. So you should, if you are using lead based solder, you should really have gloves on. So the difference between the two really is that leaded solder is much easier to work with, and I highly recommend it for beginners, but lead-free is supposed to be a safer option. What I've actually read online is that leaded solder, in the grand scheme of things, is actually safer though, because lead-free solder can be really bad for your lungs, whereas lead-based solder is not as bad, doesn't release as toxic of fumes when you're soldering. The only thing is, obviously make sure that you wash your hands right after you solder. Don't touch anything, obviously don't eat anything, and you should be good there. So I'm not going to wear gloves just because I feel comfortable not wearing them and taking that risk, but you definitely should if you're using lead-based at least. The next thing you should wear is some kind of a mask or respirator if you don't have proper ventilation. I'm in a pretty large room, so I have good ventilation, and to help with that, you should get a small fan. So mine is just one that I bought on Amazon. It's from F-Stop Labs. I think it works pretty great. On this fan, there's a filter that's replaceable. So when you see it starting to get a little gray, or maybe it's been 6 to 8 months or so, you should probably replace it. I have some replacements ready to go. It's always a good idea to order some extras. So you can just kind of remove it like this. Be careful not to touch this, especially if you've been using leaded solder, because everything that's on here is probably toxic. So like, just don't touch it, just throw it in the garbage when you're done. Make sure you don't just blow the fan, because that's just blowing the same fumes around. It's not actually taking anything toxic out of the air. So that's a little point there. Back there. So you're going to want to set up your fan. I like to have it on the left hand side because I'm right-handed. I like to have all of my like my iron and my solder and everything ready to go on my right hand side here. So I'm going to have my fan on the left, and it's just going to be plugged in over off to the side, so it's nice and easy. You guys can see it there. The next thing you're going to need obviously is your soldering iron. So this is my soldering iron. It's not an amazing one, but I got it pretty cheap on Amazon in a kit. Now this is one that actually has the temperature on the handle. Not all of them do. If yours doesn't, then, and it doesn't have just a regular plug like this that goes into a 120 volt socket, then you're gonna need an actual proper what's it called, like power supply, where you adjust the temperature on that. This one is pretty basic, literally just an on-off switch here, and my temperature. You're going to want to set your temperature to around 300 degrees Celsius, so I'm going to do that right now. I don't know if you can see that, set to 300 degrees Celsius there. I'm going to take a look at my tip. You know, are there any chunks of metal on it? Maybe if you were working with something that had plastic as well, is there any plastic stuck on it? You know, just make sure it's generally clear of debris. I'm going to make sure that everything is nice and tight, because this does loosen to service. So I'm going to make sure it's nice and tight. My tip is on there nice and tight. You can also get replaceable tips if yours is getting pretty gross, like mine is pretty gross right now. Here's some examples of some tip replacements. There's a large variety. It depends on what you're doing. If you're doing something like surface soldering, you're going to want something very small like this one. Because you're working with very tiny, delicate pieces that don't require quite as much heat, because they're smaller, but they burn and will get wrecked quite easily. So there's some examples. But the one that's already on it should be fine. Something about this size, you can never really go wrong. If your tip, if you've been using it and it's really black, or maybe you got a used one and you're not really sure what to do with it, you're going to want to clean this. So what I recommend using for cleaning is this little thing you can get in the plumbing aisle. I don't even know what it's called. Doesn't even say on here, but it's basically got like a bunch of tiny spikes inside of it. So that's what I use to clean the tip of my soldering iron. You can do this by just literally just kind of pressing it in around the sides. I think it works really well compared to other ones that I've used. Some people like to use a sponge. See, look, it's already really nice and shiny. Some people like to use a sponge, like a wet sponge. So if you get the sponge with your kit, this one came with a sponge, but I don't use it because I don't think it works as well. You just add just a little bit of water onto the sponge to make it damp, and then, you know, you'll wipe it off on the sponge like so. And that works okay to clean it off. The other thing that also works really well is brass wool. So you'll get like a little ball of it. You can either just have the actual ball like on the table and go like this with it, but that's kind of dangerous. So what I recommend is getting like a little tray like this, you know, and putting your steel wool on it, or not your steel wool, your brass wool, and then doing it like that. That's just what I recommend. Alright, so you have your iron. It's not plugged in right now because it would melt through my mat. I've got something to clean it with. I've cleaned the tip. It's like fairly clean right now. It's good enough to do the job. It's ready to go. I'm going to put my cleaning station there. The next thing that I need is a stand for my iron. So I have this stand that it came with, but I tried to like put it together. And honestly, it was pretty bad. It didn't really work very well. I don't recommend getting one that's like this because even when I put the screw in here, it kept coming loose really easily, and it wasn't working for me. So what I decided to do is, it's not as safe and I don't recommend it. Just buy a good stand. Don't waste your money. But I just chucked this thing, flip this upside down, or even this way if you wanted, but I put it upside down and I just rest my iron like that inside of it. So it's got this little bump here, so I just rest it in here and it's working fine for me. So I'm gonna put my stand also on the right hand side, make sure my wires are out of the way. You don't really want wires crossing. You want to use an extension cord if you need to keep everything nice and neat, because the last thing you need is to accidentally melt through one of your wires, right? And now, you know, what are you gonna use to stitch it back up together or solder it back together, because it was your soldering iron, right? So, you know, just make sure everything is nice and clean. I've got my solder. I'm going to put it on my left hand side. You'll see why in one of my later videos. So I've got my setup. If you want, you can choose to use helping hands. I think that they're super helpful. So they're called helping hands because it's almost like having another set of hands. So if I'm working on something, let's say like I wanted to solder to, I don't know, this tiny screwdriver for some reason. Let's say this is my electronic and I want to solder to it. It's so much easier now if the helping hands are holding that. I have my solder and my iron and I can just go like this, right? And I can solder onto it. Much easier than trying to have it on the ground. These are definitely a must, or even like if you don't want to buy these, you have some kind of vise or anything that can hold them, that's totally cool. But highly recommend. These ones are okay, they're not amazing, but again, like they were cheap, they do the job. I like the magnifying glass. This is really good for me because I have bad eyes, I got glasses, so like it's really nice to have the extra boost of vision there. I like to set these up. It's kind of like weird getting them and setting them up at first, but I like to just have my pliers here and then kind of bend this over and have it almost like at a 45-degree angle. I find that works the best to get the best magnification. So I mean, you guys can see here. So that works pretty well. Sorry if I'm going really in depth. I'm kind of doing this video as if somebody's never even seen soldering before. They don't know what it is. You know, they're trying to look to see what they need to get. So I'm just really breaking it down to the basics. That's pretty much what this video is. So I've got my helping hands. They're going to be on my mat because this is where I'm going to actually be doing the soldering. And then the next tool is my desoldering tool. It kind of looks like a plunger. You know, you can push it in and you press the button and it pops out. So in a later video I'm going to be showing you how to desolder. I believe that's video 2, so take a look at that. I'll have the link up at the top right hand corner so you can take a look at that one, but that's how you desolder, which I'll be showing. I'm going to put this off to the right hand side here as well. I don't know if you can see that, but it's just over here out of the way. And now I am pretty much set up and ready to go. I've got my solder, I've got my soldering iron, stand, helping hands, something to clean it with, desoldering tool, and my fan, which I'm going to turn on when I'm soldering. And I should be ready to go. I also should be wearing a respirator if I don't have a fan, or like at least a shot mask or something. Make sure it's a well ventilated area because, you know, soldering fumes are not very good to breathe in. Like I was reading some articles and it does cause things like asthma and whatnot in the long term. So do make sure that your, you know, protective gear is on. Wear glasses if, you know, it's recommended. I mean, I already have glasses, so I don't really need to, But yeah, just be safe, guys. Don't burn yourselves. If you're super scared of that, then you can wear some kind of like heat-proof gloves, but that'll make it really difficult for you to do things. You'll see why in later videos. So, you know, just be careful. And yeah, that's how you set up your soldering station. Hopefully this was helpful. I'm going to leave a list of the things that you'll need, like everything I have out here, below, so take a look at that. And yeah, I'll see you guys next time. Hey folks, so today we're going to go over what I recommend is the very first exercise you should do when learning how to solder, which is soldering and desoldering on a proto board. So I'm not attaching anything to this proto board. I'm just doing very, very preliminary stuff. I'm just teaching you how to push solder and actually get a little ball of solder going on your soldering iron and actually putting it onto like a copper plate. So these are little copper plates here. As you can see, this is my solder I've got here, showed in an earlier video, the kind that I'm using. This is my soldering iron. I've already cleaned it. Make sure that you clean your soldering iron. Because I've let it sit for a little bit, I'm just going to clean it a little bit more. Alright, now it's nice and clean, and I'm ready to go. I've got a somewhat clean tip. I've got my solder. I'm going to have my iron in my dominant hand, which is my right hand for me, and I'm going to have my solder in my non-dominant hand. So soldering iron, solder. I'm using lead-free right now. Actually, no, I'm using leaded right now. It's a different kind of solder I'm using, and I'm going to show you how to do your first solder. So what you're going to want to do is take your tip and find a somewhat silver patch on it. Place it onto the copper pad, and you're going to want to push the solder into it, just like that. And then I'm going to get my handy dandy tool, clean it off, and I'm ready to do the next one. So that was a little bit too big. See, it's a little bit of a bubble. You kind of want more of a triangle shape, like pyramidal shape when you're doing soldering, but that's okay. I'm going to move on to my next little pad here. I'm going to heat it up for a second, push my solder, and release. And now I have another little solder. So I want you to follow along with your soldering iron and solder and do this. Make sure you have your fan going and keep the fan close by. So I would want to have the fan as close as right here to what I'm doing. I also recommend using helping hands. As you can see, makes life a lot easier. Definitely a must. And I'm going to move on to my next little pad here. So I'm going to touch it, heat it up, and push the solder, let go, and there we go. I've soldered another little plate. So I recommend doing this for an entire row, to be honest, to get used to it, at least an entire row, just to get used to the feel of, you know, touching a plate, pushing the solder, and letting go. Touching a plate, pushing the solder, and letting go, right? Just getting used to the feel of soldering, because this really is the basis. And make sure you get used to cleaning every couple solders. If you're going really slow, then I recommend doing it every 2 solders even, or even after every solder, so that you get in the habit. Because I know sometimes I'll go like 10-15 minutes in soldering and it'll be like, oh my goodness, I need to clean the tip, and you end up wrecking it in the long run. So, you know, just be mindful of that. So I recommend doing this entire row. So I'm just going to do this entire row really quickly. And then the other thing, now that you've got a bunch of balls of solder in a row, is you probably will have some that look kind of like this one, or some that aren't really perfectly shaped. The great thing about solder is that you can reheat it and kind of move it around. So this one here, I can see a little bit of the copper pad, so it's not a perfect connection. I'm just going to hold my soldering iron on it, and then it re-liquefies. You can see that? I'm just going to take it off, and now it's covered the pad completely. And then you can see it almost fogs over. That's how you know that it's dry. So I can touch these now. They're completely cooled down. They're no longer like molten metal. So I can do that with any of them, really. You just touch them, they become liquid again, and you can kind of move them around as much as you want. If I want to make like a little triangular shape, this is much easier to do, like moving them around like this when you have lead-free. You can make little sculptures with lead-free almost. This is leaded. Leaded is definitely ideal because you see the way this is behaving now? Because I've had it melted for so long, I'm getting rid of what's called the flux, which is, what makes it kind of stay in perfect little bubble shapes. And right now, that I'm not able to really get that perfect bubble shape anymore because I've burned out all of that flux. So that's one thing you'll notice if you're using lead-free. It can be a lot more frustrating for beginners, so I recommend using leaded for beginners. And, just hold your breath when you're doing it. I'm never breathing in when I'm doing this. The fan is not on because I'm talking at the same time, obviously, but never ever breathe in while you're soldering. That's just a good practice. So now I've got a bunch of these little bubbles here. I'm going to teach you how to desolder. So you're going to want to get your handy dandy little plunger, little desoldering tool that I showed in the first video on how to set up a soldering station. What you're going to do is you're going to push it in all the way until it locks. So you can see I have it pushed in here. And when you're ready, when you hear the click later, like the little plunging noise almost, that's when I press this button. So when I press the button, it kind of sucks everything back in. So anything that was in front of this little nozzle here, when I press it, it sucks in air and solder. It sucks in solder with it. So you're gonna heat up one of the pads, hold the plunger near it, and suck it up. So as you can see, it's definitely not perfect, and I'm not the most amazing person at doing it in the world, but when you have to remove some solder, you have to remove some solder. So I'm just going to keep trying to get this little guy off here, and that one worked a little better. So what I'm doing is I'm just heating it up and quickly sucking up the solder. So as you can see, it's never all going to be gone. There's still going to be some left on your copper plate, but at least now, if you were trying to take a wire off or a pin header or something, you would be able to get the wire through it now. And if you were doing wire to wire, then you can get it off quickly too. So I'm just going to do another one here. There, that one came off almost all in one go. It just takes practice. So what I would recommend doing now is going back over your row and desoldering them all. You should not have solder going through it to the other side. If you have solder sticking out the other side, you've applied heat onto your solder for too long, and you have too much solder on your board. The other problem you might run across is them connecting. So if this is happening, you have too much solder and you need to maintain better control and not move your hand so much when you are placing your solder. And make sure that you're not remelting one of the other solder, like little balls, when you are, make sure you're not remelting one of the little balls when you are going to do a new solder, right? Because if you do, then obviously when you're pushing the solder, it's going to want to push it into the other one as well, because it's also connected to your soldering iron. So that'll naturally morph them together, which you don't want. So just make sure that everything stays dry, everything stays solidified, except for the one plate that you're trying to work on. And if you wanted to connect them together, then all you would have to do is you should add a little bit of solder, but to connect them, you're going to want to heat up one and heat up the other, and just kind of shimmy them around until they connect. And now two are connected. So I can do this for the next one. And then when you're doing this, you should probably add a little solder, but just for demonstration's sake, I'm gonna connect these guys. So what happened here was I was applying heat on this for too long. So what do we think happened here? It went through. So now my little hole here is filled with solder, right? So that I had too much solder on there and it went all the way through, and I applied heat for too long. So now I need to redo that guy, and hopefully there's not too much solder, like there's a little ball underneath now. where it went through. So that's what I meant by you don't want anything on the other side because you've applied too much solder or you've applied heat for too long. You should not have solder going through it to the other side. If you have solder sticking out the other side, you've applied heat onto your solder for too long and you have too much solder on your board. The other problem you might run across is them connecting. So if this is happening, you have too much solder and you need to maintain better control and not move your hand so much when you are placing your solder. And make sure that you're not remelting one of the other solder, like little balls, when you are, make sure you're not remelting one of the little balls when you are going to do a new solder, right? Because if you do, then obviously when you're pushing the solder, it's going to want to push it into the other one as well because it's also connected to your soldering iron. So that'll naturally morph them together, which you don't want. So just make sure that, everything stays dry, everything stays solidified, except for the one plate that you're trying to work on. And if you wanted to connect them together, then all you would have to do is you should add a little bit of solder, but to connect them, you're going to want to heat up one and heat up the other, and just kind of shimmy them around until they connect. And now two are connected. So I can do this for the next one. And then when you're doing this, you should probably add a little solder, but just for demonstration's sake, I'm gonna connect these guys. So what happened here was I was applying heat on this for too long. So what do we think happened here? It went through. So now my little hole here is filled with solder, right? So that I had too much solder on there and it went all the way through, and I applied heat for too long. So now I need to redo that guy, and hopefully there's not too much solder, like there's a little ball underneath now where it went through. So that's what I meant by you don't want anything on the other side because you've applied too much solder or you've applied heat for too long.